I guess done. All right. So the first thing that we were interested in was like what motivates someone's violent behavior. And one of the things we talked about a lot is like humans are complex and you can't really just choose like one theory. So I kind of saw it as a spectrum where almost everyone is born with a range of emotions and is capable of both empathy and violent anger. But that different biological factors in your cortex and your amygdala kind of put you somewhere on the spectrum from like total empathy to total violence. But then like from your origin point on the spectrum, based on your like parental nurture experience, and then also like how much privilege you have in society and how your needs are met from that biological origin point on the spectrum, you could like flow one way or another, and that almost everyone has the capacity to go like either way to any point on the spectrum after their origin point, but that like if your biology or some part of your childhood pushed you more towards the violent side, you do have the agency to like make the choice to lead a more empathetic life, but that it takes more effort and more like conscious discipline to make the choice if your biology or your nurture is working against you.
Yeah, so just to expand on that a little bit, like Anya said, we examined this range that you really can't, I mean, you can, but we really couldn't pick a singular theory to go by from our readings, given that we feel that it's a combination of your nature and nurture, so your past experiences and like what is going on biologically inside of you and how that develops, right? So if you become a violent person, is that a product of, we're asking what motivates that violence? Is that a product of nature, nurture, your past experiences? And we're saying it's everything all together. But as Anya said, it really depends upon where you start and where your origin is. And, you know, you could have a situation where maybe somebody who was biologically predisposed to becoming violent grew up in a household that was kind and caring and loving, and as per Burroughs' theory, that would sort of perpetuate behaviors that would lean towards a less violent person. But maybe if that same person were born into a household that was in an underserved community, or that was in a violent community, or that there was already interpersonal violence going on in that family, with that predisposition, their behaviors might lean toward more violent behaviors.
So then in terms of the second question of like different causal explanations for either interpersonal or collective violence, we kind of agreed that all of these factors, like whether they be biological or societal, can interact with each other on a small or large level. But something that I noticed was that many cultures strongly link violence with morality. So we're talking about this like with examples of original sin and like different religious conceptions of how we should treat violence, and like different societies' punishment of violence. And so then along with that, we talked about how collective violence can be rooted in like group versus group mentality. So one like literary example of this was Lord of the Flies, and then Clementine brought up this like study from this psychology study from the 1950s, where identical groups of 5th grade boys were like placed in 2 groups and developed like group versus group mentality that was like actually very detrimental. So then kind of the conclusion to this is that since moral codes are something that groups can identify with and care about deeply. They can sometimes provide the grounds for conflict to occur, and then if that can't be resolved or remedied, then that conflict can result in collective violence or like warfare. So then on the other hand, this doesn't necessarily mean that collective violence is solely the result of learned behavior, because individuals are like what makes up the group, and the need to protect the group and maintain like your identification with the group is also balanced by your individual innate ability to commit violence or like decide whether or not you want to put yourself at personal risk. Okay.
Kind of building on some of this, I think it's definitely important to know, this is kind of echoing what a lot of my group members have already said, but interpersonal violence is created because of a plethora of different factors. And we can't really pin it down to just one. But I think a possible alternative explanation could be some like structural inequalities that occur within our communities. And I think the way that the structural inequalities create interpersonal and collective violence or influence it are kind of different. I think like on an interpersonal level, inequalities can kind of show up with the amount of time like parents are able to spend with their children, or the inability to have access to clean food or clean air and water. And then I think as the structural inequalities affect collective violence as far as rebellions go, I think that's kind of a catapulting factor for that, because I think that's how people are responding to not being able to have the things they need to live a full and whole life in society.
And so lastly, the questions our group was left with are, first of all, criminologists often argue that crime is a symptom of a greater societal disease. And so we were wondering, can and should violence also be seen that way? And then second of all, in terms of Burroughs and Barash's arguments about predispositions to violence genetically and psychologically, our group wondered how physical environments play into this concept. So physical environments can play into physical brain-like development, like factors such as vitamin deficiencies, malnutrition, etc., play into how well and how extensively the brain is developed. And so also these physical environments can play into psychological development as well, and people's mindsets about what they have and what they deserve and what society thinks they deserve. So we wondered how and if the authors would consider the this kind of comparison or this this way of thinking about things.